Weeks ago we did, I wouldn't call it a deep dive, but a bit of a shallow dive into socialism and sort of what that word means and what I think of when I think of socialism and what it means as a political term, and the weaponization of the term socialism as that's used, and in current politics, and sort of how it draws on recent historical connotations with communism and sort of Cold War aspects of Red Scare stuff. And so I thought that was pretty that was just like interesting for me. It's interesting for me to really think of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about socialism, what I hear people reacting to in different ways, whether strongly pro, strongly anti, what it means to them, and so talking about capitalism seemed like just a nice. It seemed to fit pretty well together. So I have put together. I'm not a historian or anything like that. So I wanted to do kind of a story of capitalism as I see it from my point of view, and sort of share that with all of you. And everything that I've done in researching it has been from my own point of view. Obviously, I'm not trying to. So I have a bias against the current capitalist system. I think I have an understanding of sort of why we're in this thing, but I'm deeply concerned with interrogating what it means to live in this capitalist system, and what the bigger ramifications are for it. And most importantly, I think that, and if I can add anything to the conversation at all, I think where I wind up is that there is no necessity to accepting. There's a book that I'll refer to a couple times, and definitely next week even more, but Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. This idea that kind of we're in this capitalist system, and that's the only way that things could really ever function. And I think that's pretty misguided. I think that we would all be served by looking more deeply at what this thing actually is that we live in. I mean, that's a sort of a constant. The idea of, I heard somebody refer to this as presentism. This kind of idea that the way things are is sort of the way that things will always be. I'm certainly prone to that. It feels like it just doesn't feel like it could ever be any other way, and it feels that you've kind of evolved to a point, and then that is the point that you will be at. And I think that where we are right now is just it's a transitory thing, and we will be moving into something else. It's interesting that we get caught in presentism because it's never that way. And even the capitalism that we talk about now really bears very little resemblance to the capitalism of, say, 250 years ago, when it was this nascent sort of moral economic philosophy, this sort of burgeoning new philosophy. So that's a good segue into this bit, which is the scripted bit. So first of all, thanks everybody for tuning in to the Empathy Anarchy Show. I know people will be in and out, and whatever you take from it, shoot me chats, shoot me DMs. I will try to get to them later on, and let me know what serves you, what serves the conversation, and I am trying to just keep this discussion going. On Sunday nights, my spiritually lowest time of the week. So, all right. So, capitalism, as such, has been around for 250 ish years. And the intertwining of the American psyche and capitalism is old. They kind of were born in around the same time, and that identification runs deep into the American psyche. And I see it a lot today in political discussions, in the way that capitalism, like, say, Christianity, is so completely intertwined with the way Americans define themselves. And I mean that definition, like that deep-seated kind of belief in yourself, like that Americanness. And so it becomes a thing that is, it may be hard to examine in some ways. And whenever you sort of want to pull it out and take a look at it, it feels like you're taking some essential part of yourself out. I mean, this is not my reaction to it, but it's a feeling that I get from a lot of people. It's like a feeling of like, you can't take that out and look at it. It's too important. It's too ingrained. And so it becomes like that. It's just the air that we breathe, the water that the fish swim in the metaphor, right? And it becomes, it takes on a feeling of utter inevitability. So there's multiple threads to my thinking here. One is just, what is capitalism? Good, bad, otherwise? What is the long-term effect of capitalism on the world that we live in? And then what happens next? Where are we going next? And for me, this is not, most of this is not rooted in the more academic discussion of it, even though we'll spend a lot of time in that stuff. I have to say right off the bat, all of this is really, for me, rooted firmly right now in the idea of climate change, of the of what we are looking at as this, of the human changing epoch, where our patterns of consumption are changing the world rapidly in ways that look like it's going to make it uninhabitable for us. We are decimating most of the natural world. And so I think that there's two sides of the discussion. One is the, like, is this the most just, moral, efficient system out there? No, I think. And then there's the other side of it, which is we absolutely just cannot continue on the path that we are on, and expect to have human civilization in the near future. That's just the facts. So that part of it is inescapable. And yeah, as Brant points out in the chat over on Twitch, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think we need to flip that around in our heads fast. So yeah, I would say that as a direct result of of American-style consumptive capitalism, growth, that being the fundamental measuring stick for everything, for every kind of progress, growth of capital, growth of consumption. That's how that's the universally sort of default measure. Sometimes we talk about like other ancillary benefits like standard of living and life expectancy and so forth. But what we really when we get down to it, the way that we make our political decisions, the way that we make our business decisions, the way that we decide how we interact with the world that we live in is based on growth and consumption, and the necessity of growth and consumption, and the necessity of for next year's consumption to be more than this year. And that to me seems untenable. So this is not just a strictly like, do I believe in socialism versus this person believes in like unfettered free markets. Let's just see which academic argument wins out. I will submit at the top of this whole thing, and I will come back to this over and over again, that the idea that we can continue on with unfettered growth and consumption is simply not going to work. We're going to have to find something else. Some people might suggest that the way to find that something else is through capitalist market innovations, trust the market, etc. We can get to that later. I don't buy it. But as we collectively try to decide what we're going to do to continue having civilization on this planet, if that's even a thing that we want to do, we're going to have to make some really hard decisions about the systems that we use moving forward. And I think that using this system, this capitalist system, is not going to work. But that's kind of down the road, but I'm just putting that out there right now. So tonight and next week kind of breaks down like this, in my thinking. And keep throwing questions at me. I'll try to get to them as best as I can. But and if I say anything that really chafes on you, toss that at me too. I want this to be a discussion as best as possible, but I also have like a bunch of stuff that I want to get through. So anyway, so I think it breaks down kind of like this. We have the early days of capitalism, foundational stuff, where it is almost as much a philosophical or a system of moral philosophy as a financial one. Then you've got this period of developing capitalism happening in tandem with the Industrial Revolution. The two things kind of are just like fundamentally intertwined. And that's all sort of tied in with the period of revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, this toppling of monarchies, this rethinking about how people relate to their governments, increasing democracy, and so forth. So these things are all like intertwined, and I don't want to discount any of that because it's important. It's important to realize how we got here rather than just sort of saying like, I don't want any more of that, or that's the only way to live, which seems to be like the sort of binary way that the conversations about capitalism versus socialism versus some sort of communist Marxism, how that breaks out. Like it's just good, bad, and we don't really indulge so much in the ways that we might be able to borrow one from the other and come up with something new down the road. So then there's capitalism in the United States and the two world wars. And then there's post-World War II capitalism in the United States, the Cold War, and the ways that capitalism versus communism as these kind of mortal enemies through the Cold War informs our thinking still today across the body politic. And I'm going to set aside sort of the sort of resurgent, or how would you say, like the rising left wing of the Democratic Party, which I personally think is sort of the right, that's the beacon on the hill for me, or whatever you want to call it. Like that's the light that I want to go towards. But you see, like in centrist Democrats, there is this pulling back, there is this, and I think it's largely informed by feeling burned by this Cold War Red Scare mentality. And within that, in the 70s, there comes this new idea of this kind of like the dawn of neoliberalism, and this idea that markets and businesses and corporations only exist to serve their shareholders. And it's the full stripping. It's kind of like the reaching the apex of capitalism as as an amoral moral philosophy. You have no responsibility except for more consumption. So capitalism itself is evolving over time, and if you were to take capitalism from 1776 and put it up next to capitalism from 1980, they really, you would be like, okay, those are the same species, but they've really changed quite a lot. Neoliberalism takes us into Reaganism and this idea that the government and taxes are just the enemy. And then you have sort of the next stop on the way is like Clinton era centrist Democrat corporatists, and that takes us to Donald Trump, and that takes us to like sort of the brink of annihilation. Not saying that those are the only things that brought us here, but that's sort of my thinking. That's my line of big historical stuff. So that's that. Let's party. So, 1776, American Revolution starts. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is published. I don't know who. I'm going to assume that everybody is like background familiar with Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was a Scottish. Man, why didn't I check that out? It was a Scottish, British thinker, academic, and he moral philosopher, right? And so his idea in the Wealth of Nations, the sort of groundbreaking new thing in the Wealth of Nations that he laid out, was that the wealth of nations, what he's talking about, is the wealth comes from the labor of the people and the flow of goods and services of those people, and that is the ultimate economic function of economic life. That's the lifeblood of it. It's not to serve the king. It's not for the church. It's for the people. The people are the wealth of the nation. The people and their labor are the wealth of nations that he's talking about. And at the time, right, put this in the context of the time, I imagine that really strikes a revolutionary chord in a lot of ways. And I think that Wealth of Nations still, it feels like one of these sort of originalist, almost like quasi-religious texts. It functions in our collective psyche in some ways the way that the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, or for some of us the Bible, where we perpetually sort of frame our conversations around these original texts, but we don't really understand or closely read them, and we don't really adjust our thinking in this time period based on the fact that these texts were written at a specific time, in a specific place, in reaction to specific conditions and realities then. And they are not necessarily meant to be perpetual blueprints for how everything works. But here we are in sort of late stage American Western style capitalism, and for better or worse, our today capitalism traces its roots back to Adam Smith, and his theories continue to occupy an important position in the development of economic thought today. So I there's so much in there, and it's such a it's actually an interesting read. And I pulled one quote out that just has like some staying power for me, and I didn't want to find something that I wanted to find something that was just sort of right in the middle, where I'm like, oh, I'm kind of on board with that, but I also kind of that sort of rubs me the wrong way. So anyway, here it is. Every individual is continually exerting himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever capital he can command. It is his own advantage, indeed, and not that of the society which he has in view. But the study of his own advantage naturally, or rather necessarily, leads him to prefer that employment which is most advantageous to society. He intends only his own gain, and he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was not part of his intention. I think that that has in it the phrase "the invisible hand," which you'll hear a lot of economists who are they sort of talk about the invisible hand of the market, and they talk about they have a sort of there's a sort of a feeling that the market has an undirected wisdom of its own, and that's why I picked. Yeah, that's why I really like this quote, because this one sits right in the middle for me. It partly gets me on the side of like, ugh, and just makes me sort of go, ugh, I'm not crazy about that. This idea that each individual is just trying to find out what is in his or her own self-interest. But also this idea that people working sort of for themselves to get better also creates maybe a larger, better idea. So yeah, like to my sort of anarcho-socialist, libertarian kind of ears, there's this sort of poetry to it. Like 17-year-old me definitely would go, yeah, totally, that makes sense. Like, people are just selfish and they just do what they need. And then if a bunch of selfish people get together and under a decent legal framework act towards their own self-interest, you'll wind up better off. I go like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And I imagine that if you were like just coming out of the dark ages of Europe, or you were a peasant farmer, or sort of like an industrious craftsperson or something in Western Europe, or a colonizer in the U.S., you might look at something like that and go like, yeah, that's like my liberation theology. Nobody is in charge of us but us, and we get to decide what we do with our time and energy. I imagine that that's sort of like pretty cool, right? At the time, we'll let the market decide. So yeah, like if I'm sitting in my house and I knit some scarves and I put these scarves out on the table and I say I want $20 for my scarf and nobody buys my scarf, maybe I'll try selling them for 10. Or if everybody buys them up real quick, maybe I'll think, maybe I'll raise the price of my scarves. Or maybe I'll think, no, I like selling my scarves real cheap, so lots of people get scarves. But whatever, it's up to me. There's no king telling me what to do. I can't make scarves because boys aren't supposed to knit, whatever, none of that. I'm just one free person choosing what to do with their labor. Love it. All good. So let's put a pin in that idea and set it aside for a bit. But I want to come back to it later on, and we'll just call that like the scarf. We'll just call that like the scarf idea, and maybe we'll double back on that. I mean, not maybe, we will, because I think that's kind of the capitalist fantasy, that's the thing that I think people are afraid is being attacked. Yeah, so let's sort of jump back to more late stage capitalism, like right now. And I did us all the funsies of digging around in some very pro-capitalist publications. And I just tried to pull some stuff that was like not super extreme on any, but I thought was representative. So I went into American Spectator. Alexandra Hudson is writing. This is back in February. I also tried to keep it super recent. Talking about Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations. Um, Smith, this Alexandra Hudson says, Smith also knew, however, that markets had great potential to lift entire cities and nations out of poverty, but that for one very rich man there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. This is the cradle. This is the bed upon which trickle down and rising tide lifts all boats, and all of these justifications live. For Smith, written in American Spectator, for Smith, inequality was worth the universal opulence that markets would produce, because the benefits of markets would quote, extend itself to the lowest ranks of the people. Depends. Just depends. That's the fantasy. That's the fantasy idea, is that everybody gets better in these situations. Now, where we really get into this is for pro-capitalists like this. They are willing to just shut it right down right there. They go on, this has certainly proven true. Over the past 200 years, extreme poverty in the world has fallen from 90% to 10%. Most of that over the last 3 decades alone. So while the rich may be getting richer, the lot of the poor is improving dramatically. Exploitation of the poor, not investment, not existing institutions, but a mere idea which the philosopher and economist Adam Smith called the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. When people are given equality before the law, this is the conclusion, en masse, leave them alone, and it turns out that they become extraordinarily creative and energetic. Again, this is one of those ones that hits me like sort of in the middle-ish. I'm not ready to sign off on the sort of like, well, what are you going to do about it on wealth inequality? I am a fan of lifting people out of poverty. Is this the only way to do it? I don't know. That seems to be the implicit part of the argument, right? The implicit part of the pro-capitalist argument is this wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for capitalism. So, but what I really want to zero in here for me is when people are given equality before the law en masse, leave them alone, and it turns out that they become extraordinarily creative and energetic. So let's say that we buy everything else that they're saying, right? Let's say that we buy that maybe wealth inequality is not such a terrible thing. Again, I'm just stipulating to that stuff. I'm not going to argue that on its merits right now. But even if I stipulate to that, even if I stipulate that the best way to lift people out of poverty is to allow capitalism to run rampant, equality before the law. If you're going to argue that we have equality before the law, or have ever had equality before the law, I don't think so. And I think that that is a fundamental problem. That is not something that we can just skate by and sort of move forward. And that is the go-to move in the pro-capitalist argument is, yeah, sure, but let's move on from that. When people are given equality before the law, then everything will work out fine. I'd also say when people are given equality under the law and the laws are just, everything might work out fine. When people are given equality under the law and the laws are just and the legal system's first duty is to serve the best interests of the people, then maybe everything would work out fine. But is that what we have? Do we have a fair legal system that treats everyone equally? And this is not just sort of trying to nitpick at this thing. This is, I think, foundational, because I think that when you allow the inequality before the law, when you allow the inequality in the system to just sit there and fester, which is what we do, I think that it makes everything that comes out of the capitalist machine more dangerous, more likely to cause harm. And I think that that gets to the heart of where I think that we are so broken in our capitalist system, in our use of the capitalist system. So, why is it so important to jump immediately into the justice system when we're talking about capitalism? The fundamental underpinning to a capitalist system is private property, right? Here's another good one. George Reisman, emeritus professor at Pepperdine, writes in a paper, "The security of property made the American people both industrious and provident, because they knew that they could keep all that they earned and be able to benefit from all that they saved." So ownership, right? And the arbiters of who owns what when there's a dispute are going to be the judges and the lawyers and the police. That's going to be where the rubber meets the road. And if we're going to talk about whether or not capitalism, despite its many evils, is still the best option for us, then we have to look at the ways that it adjudicates the system of laws. And we have to look at the fact that it is fundamentally, in the United States, based on theft. And everybody has to acknowledge that. I mean, there's no way around it. But the people who acknowledge it and say, like, yeah, but let's just move forward, capitalism's the best thing we've got, they just throw up their hands and go, well, what are you going to do? It was a long time ago. Indigenous peoples in North America, Central America, South America, 300 years of slavery. What are you going to do? Let's just move forward. And I think that there's just absolutely no way to do that. You can't just move forward on that stuff. You can't. In other words, if your central idea is that capitalism represents this way for all the people to just exercise their own self-interest and everything will sort of work out in this invisible hand of the market way, but a massive number of people have been excluded, have had their land stolen, have had their labor stolen, have had their lives stolen, well then we haven't really had even a market working the way that it should work. And I think that that fundamental injustice, illegal theft, over time, because capital is durable over time, and that's another one of the things that is fundamental to it, over time has then led us into a place where a very small number of capitalists are actually the ones that make the meaningful decisions. And because it's a very small number of people with an incredibly concentrated amount of wealth and power, we don't make good decisions for the world writ large. So some of this process, whether it's going to happen within a capitalist framework or some other kind of framework, is going to have to acknowledge, go back to the original sins that this late stage capitalism was founded on, and incorporate people whose ancestors and they themselves now are victims of it, incorporate them into the conversation. And I think actually it goes further than that. It goes more towards an actual reversal of who is making decisions about who is making the big decisions. I'm going a little off script here because I just get had this for later, but like I cannot say, I can't say this enough, because I think that over and over again, I want to make sure that I'm just being like so explicit about this. I am not giving a nod to the former past evils that man, I wish it hadn't gone down like that, but now here we are, so let's all just keep doing the best that we can. I think that fundamental to any movement forward has to be a circling back and an attempt to actively right these historic wrongs. Okay, I'm going to try to get back on track here real quick. But I've said it, I'll say it that time, and then I'll say it another time, and then I'll say it another time, but it cannot be said enough that when your initial investment in the country is stolen, and your initial, like the initial brain trust that comes up with your plan of action is so rife with criminality and amorality. I mean, I'm thinking specifically in the foundational principles of the Atlantic slave trade and treaties with indigenous peoples in North America, Central America, South America. Like those two things. I mean, there's so much more to jump onto, but those two are so egregious. And the initial theft is so monumental that I think you can't consider moving forward within this system or without this system without figuring out some way to make that shit right. I don't know what it is, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be front and center in the conversation. I mean, it's central, right? It's central to the American mythology, and I mean like the power structure mythology, that you sort of arrive in this place that is unknown to you before, and it just seems vast and nearly infinite in resources, and also it was like put there for you to take. Like the world was put there for you to dominate and extract from. This is a very different relationship to the land and to the world than other cultures have. This is like, it feels like it's sometimes just the only way that that anybody goes about their business, but that's just not the case. It's not the case at all. And so I think that this fundamental sort of immoral, unethical, illegal idea, stealing this stuff and then sort of like taking that, laundering, you kind of steal the thing and then you kind of launder the money back through the laws, right? I mean, that's kind of what it is, right? You kind of steal the land and then you smush it through the treaty, and then you kind of break the treaty, and then you go like, well, here's my title for the land, and it's all kind of it's like a money laundering game. And then I don't think that's me like taking a leftist, socialist sort of stance on something. I think that that's pretty much just kind of the facts. Right? And then you take sort of the country as it was built on the backs of stolen slave labor. It's not like a leftist socialist opinion to be like, this is all ill-gotten gains. That's just facts. Now, I don't know what to I don't know what to do about it exactly, but that doesn't mean that that should stop me and literally everybody else from being like, what do we have to do to make this right? Is it reparations? Well, I mean, fuck yeah. Is it reparations on a massive scale? Yeah. I mean, that's the bare minimum. I mean, you know, in the tradition, you got to make amends. You got to find some way to make it right, just on a personal level. So, all that stuff is to me is just like utterly intertwined with capitalism, and it doesn't mean that everybody who benefits from capitalism is somehow terrible. That's the system that we're in. I fly in planes. I drive cars. I mean, I benefit from modern medicine. I don't know what medicine would be without capitalism. Would it be completely, you know what I mean? Like, it's impossible to even tell. You've been in the system for so long, there's not some alternative world where you can go like, well, that's what it would be like. And before you say like, well, not necessarily that you would say it, but before you say like, well, look to like undeveloped countries or something, I don't think so, because I'm not buying that, because nobody's escaped the reach of colonialism and capitalism, right? There's this funny phrase that I don't know if I heard it in like an economics class in college or something, but somebody said, capitalism is the worst economic system in the world, except for everything else. And again, like at 18, 19 years old, I was like, oh, that's pretty clever. I get that. That's cool. I don't buy that anymore. I think there's better stuff out there. Skipping ahead to, oh man, I'm really killing it here. We're at I'm glad I broke this up into 2 episodes. How's everybody doing out there? Just going and going. All right. So Professor Reisman. I'm just going to shout out this thing from the chat. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Okay. Yes. Yeah, there's basically, there's nowhere in the world right now that you could look and go, oh, well, that's an example of how a system would work without capitalism, because there's nowhere that escaped the influence of colonialism and capitalism, right? It was everywhere. It was all extractive. It was all about taking resources from one place, shipping them somewhere else, and then sort of doling out whatever little, survival scraps you felt like doling out from the colonizing powers. And then the capitalists are just they're a continuation of that thought. They are spiritual heirs, if not actually like cronies with. So, sorry, I keep getting off track. What I wanted to say was, here is an example of how we sort of gloss this over. This is Professor Reisman, writing in Capitalism magazine. The private property that exists today in the United States can generally be traced back through intervening purchases and sales to such original appropriations from nature. This is how he is characterizing what I was just talking about. I mean, what's appropriations? What's appropriations? That's the word you use for taking something from someone else when you've got a legal framework to do it. It's also could be stealing. And there is a necessary part of the American mythology that this land was just somehow manifest destiny open for the taking. Or there's a long-standing myth that indigenous populations didn't have concepts of private property, and so the Europeans kind of came in and they just sort of like took stuff that was all common ground. Alan Greer writes in American Historical Review that that's not the case. Indigenous populations had, well, first of all, they didn't all have one system. They had many, many, many different systems, but that many of them were characterized by having complex systems of land use and ownership. And I think that that's worth acknowledging. Like, you got to say it. Just because I didn't steal it myself doesn't mean that I'm not the beneficiary of the fact that somebody 14 generations ago did. And that, again, is tied into capital and capitalism. Because those assets, right, if you want to just frame it in terms of the economics of it, those assets from 250 years ago, if you hold on to them through the generations, I mean, generational wealth, right? This is a thing that, like, people are finally, well, I'm sorry, it's becoming, people have been talking about it for a long time. It's finally becoming a bit of a conversation just in mainstream about the effects that, like, generational wealth, intergenerational exclusion from wealth, from home ownership, have had on black and brown communities, redlining. I mean, that shit is real, and that shit is capitalism. That is, in some sense, unfettered, amoral, unethical capitalism feeds on that stuff. So, like most capitalist apologists, this guy just is like, yeah, this Professor Reisman I'm talking about, it's like, yeah, sure, we did all that stuff, people did all that stuff, it was illegal, immoral, unethical, whatever, but let's look at it in a positive light. He goes, in the process, some individuals achieved enormous personal wealth and distinction, but their success was not the cause of anyone else's impoverishment. He says, I assume with a straight face. Not the cause of anyone else's impoverishment? Okay. The economic history of the United States, he says, can be understood on the basis of a single fundamental principle. People were free, and they used their freedom to benefit themselves. I assume he also says that with a straight face. But he literally just said the opposite of that, just a couple paragraphs before that. And then he goes on to kind of pull the whole thing in, wrap it all up, and I think that this is sort of where we will wrap up for the day. But then he kind of gives it a big embracing hug. And he says, this is because, I'm skipping ahead just a little bit. People are free in the use of it. This is because all the essentials of socialism live on in the ecology movement and are enjoying growing influence in the United States, even while socialism in the form of Marxism is in decline in most of the world. Whatever, guy. I mean, that's literally all I can think to say to that is like, whatever, guy. And this is not some, like, dude in a powdered wig, ignoramus from 1810. Just to reiterate, he wrote that article last year. So I think that that's a kind of a good place to wrap up for me, for us, for today. Which is to say that, granted, I'm No, I'm not. I'm not cherry picking. This is pretty, like, I pulled a couple that I was like, that's sort of egregious and a little bit sloppy. But this is not like atypical thinking among pro-capitalist, capitalist apologist people. This is pretty middle of the road. I was not going for the extreme shit. And what I want to say about that, and what I really think, just to wrap this up and to give you the cliffhanger to bring you back next week. No, what I want to say is that the way that he very tidily moves from capitalism over here, we will forgive all the evils and so forth, and just set them aside as if they were kind of like, no harm, no foul. And then sets it up in opposition to socialism and the ecology movement, as he says. And I just want to like really like shine a light on that, because as I said at the top, that's the real that's why this is not a conversation that can go on for generations and generations. If your point of view is that you're like, oh, that nutty ecology movement over there. The ecology movement is literally trying to save the only place that we have to live. It's not some like fringe radical like idea over there. But this is the kind of thinking that I don't even think people are aware. I don't think that a lot of people are aware that they've got that in them. That they are so that is so part of their subconscious thinking, their reflexive withdrawal and sort of like revulsion at the idea of socialism or environmentalism. Like, I don't think that they realize just how deeply their own prejudices against those ideas go. And so, yeah, I think that is a good spot to leave us off with capitalism. What do we call this one? We'll call this one Capitalism Part 1. I see some people jumping in just at the end there. I appreciate you. You can check out the replay on the Instagram, or you can check it out over on Twitch. It'll be there. But in the meantime, I'm going to start the post-show music and say that is Empathy Anarchy for tonight, the 20th of December. Is that right? 20th of December, 2020. Fuck yeah. That's where we are. Our show is produced by Brant Adams. Research help from Elizabeth Weil Greenberg. The show music was composed by Charles Ellsworth. As always, big thanks to The Aquarian, Vanessa Bartlett, Marissa Armstrong. I don't know if you're out there, but thank you for everything. Shout out to Purcell in California. Until next time, everybody, keep your heads up, keep your hearts open, and don't let anything surprise you. Be good.